All right, before we begin today, just to contextualize what I do in the classroom, and that is I work with primary sources predominantly. We look at those in the room and we examine them and explore them as historians would explore them and as historians would use them. And then we sort of connect that, or I help try to connect that to secondary literature for students. And so that's in essence what we're going to do today. What we're going to look at today is the Declaration of Independence. And I often bring to class quotes from people in the time period. And today, a very short one, but I think a significant one for us. And that is the Declaration of Independence ought to be frequently read by the rising youth. It comes from the history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution by Mercy Otis Warren. So that brings us to our first issue, and that is, what is our thesis question? And we always want to keep this in mind because this is how I would want you to write your essays. Our thesis question is this: what did the Continental Congress hope to accomplish in constructing the Declaration of Independence? Now, our answer here, again, we want to prove something. We want to bring to light some proof of an answer that we've got. And my answer to this question is that the Declaration was a statement, what we might call today a mission statement, that had both importance to regional parts of the colonies and to the international world. With that said, let me see if I can begin to shed light on how or what the problems are that are facing both Jefferson, Congress, and what would be the developing nation as a whole. What kind of problems do we face here in the moments before the Declaration of Independence? For many of us, we've grown up in a world in which 1/3 of the population was in favor of a patriot cause of revolution, 1/3 of the population opposed that concept, and 1/3 was completely neutral. If we live with those numbers, if we accept those numbers, I would like to make them much more vigorously worse. That inherently America was a world of diversity. That the colonies were by no means a structured monolithic thing. Not everybody was the same thing. Yes, I think we can begin with race. That there were people who were obviously European immigrants, white. There were Blacks who were brought from Africa to this part of the world. And there were Native Americans who had been here since, well, before 1000 AD. And in that sense, then, we have a culturally diverse world to begin with. But even if we break down those Europeans that we look at that are going to participate in this revolution and oppose this revolution, we would find a very diverse group of people. Culturally, some of the first settlers were from England. Later on, settlers would come from other parts of the British Isles. They would be Welsh, they would be Scots, they would be Scots-Irish, they would be Irish. But then by the 18th century, you have a whole nother group of people coming from continental Europe. They were Germans inherently, or they were Germanic in their background. These people included people from the Palatinate, the Rhineland. They were Swiss, they were Bohemians. And these people brought an entirely new set of diversity, predominantly religion. From the New England states to the southern states to Georgia, we can find the kind of denominations that you and I walk around town and drive around town and see. There were Anglicans, there were Episcopalians, there were Presbyterians, Scots-Irish, there were future Methodists from the 18th century, there were Baptists, Rhode Island. And then you go into a whole new world of continental theologies, Lutherans, German Reformed, German Pietists, and they ran the gamut of what was almost a sort of odd set of theological perspectives. From this, then, I want you to get the idea that there is no uniform perspective on what independence is. There's no uniform perspective on what the problems are within the 13 colonies. There's no uniform perspective on what should be done. So in that sense, then, Jefferson has a large task in front of him. And if we just start out by looking at what would be the preamble, the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, if we start there, let's pick out a couple of key lines, words, phrases for us to sort of hone in on. Perhaps the most interesting statement for our purposes is Jefferson's idea that God endowed man with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government was based upon the consent of the government, and the government existed in order to protect those rights given by God. But in making this statement, Jefferson is also sort of pointing out what the problem is. And the problem is that Parliament and King George were prohibiting people, keeping colonists from their life, liberty, and pursuit. In order to somehow gather up this sort of evidence, and that's what Jefferson must do. He must present an argument to the population. He must present reasons why revolution is necessary. So the preamble really does open up the door to what Jefferson's perspective is, what the problem is. And the problem is that the British government is tyrannical. It's a tyrant. It's a despot. And it stops you from getting the things that God gives you. Now, his proof comes in a very sort of interesting way. If we step to the next section after the preamble, at the end of that preamble, Jefferson says, in a sense, now, let me tell you all the terrible things. Let me tell you all the rotten things George III has done to you. And when he's saying to you, Jefferson knows that some of these problems are individualistic. They pertain only to places like Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania. And we'll see that in some of the ones that we look at. So when you look at the Declaration of Independence, you'll notice a series of sentences, upwards of about 24 of them, that are always begin with the word he. And the pronoun here is directed at George III. So let's just take a look at some of these. We're not going to look at all 24 of them or so. We don't need to do that for our purposes. But let us begin with number 6. Number 6, he has refused for a long time to allow states to have their own legislatures. This was directed specifically at New York and Massachusetts. Then, if we move to grievance number 11, this too is a Massachusetts grievance. Jefferson writes, he has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. And this was true since the early 1770s. General Gates was stationed in Boston. If we look at number 14, we pick up on this military theme, and Jefferson writes, he has for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Now, this was not specifically written towards any specific one. In this framework, this was a general comment. And I'm trying to get you to begin to think and consider that when Jefferson uses these examples, and when he uses general examples, he's trying to encourage or get everyone in other colonies to understand that if it happens in Massachusetts, it can happen in South Carolina. That if it happens in New York, it can happen in New Jersey. And that we have, through these problems, we have a common bond. We have a singular perspective on what good government should be and what bad government truly is. If you just give me a second, let's take one more. Number 15, remember, you can literally start at number 1, you can count your way down, and you can read these right in the Declaration document. Number 15, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Here, Jefferson is referencing a legal problem, a murder trial in Maryland, in which two soldiers had killed somebody. And they, of course, found a way to be exonerated. Jefferson's points really do take us into understanding what happened, what's wrong. Because for many Americans who were living in the colonies, they actually were pro-George III. Many Americans actually felt George III was, a positive force in their lives. They supported the monarchy. By literally tagging George III as the culprit, by making him the man with the candlestick in the dining room, propelling Parliament to do these and pass these laws, George III becomes the even worse bad guy. George III becomes the man who ultimately has to be removed. That inherently monarchy is part of the problem here. The power, the idea of being able to control, the idea of having the ability to determine people's lives. Here is where Jefferson wants Americans to move from, to move away from a monarchy to a republican world, to a world in which they elect representatives, a world in which they participate in government, in which they understand that government is responsive and responsible to them because they're the ones who created it. So here's our sort of second purpose in Jefferson's Declaration. It is a goal to give people a sense of what the mission is, what the purpose is. And for that, you have to give people both what's wrong with our lives and what can we do about it. And then Jefferson has to provide, or at least some sense of what the solution is. The solution is not a continuation of where we are. The solution is a revolution. The solution is a justified position in which we can change government, not because we have the power to do it, but because we have an obligation to do it. And what we should replace it with is not continued monarchy, but republicanism, representative government. In a sense, I'd like to build for you now a bridge to where we're going to be in next week or a couple of days. That Jefferson's position down the road will reinforce this idea. That Jefferson's perspective on democracy, on republicanism, meant that men would vote, people would participate, and that from that, good government would be created. Jefferson's, in this sense, Jefferson is he's the rock. He's in cement. He started out his revolutionary moment believing in Republican government. He's going to die in 1826 believing in Republican government. And yes, I think he sees that Republican government beyond the diversity. That as long as everyone is able to participate, Republican government wins. And the tyranny and the despotism that they would understand comes to an end. It's a hard case because we are often faced with really difficult things about Jefferson. And without a doubt, Jefferson is a complex individual and he's difficult to take at times. All people are. But in this framework, in this moment, Jefferson is as consistent as he can be. He sees a problem. And it's inherently theological. You've been given something. And you've been given something by something other than government. Something other than man. You've been given to you by God. Human institutions that stand in the way of life, liberty, and the pursuit become the problem. Those problems need to be changed. Those problems need to be shifted. So there you go. It is at times perhaps the most nicest things that I could probably say about Jefferson in many ways, but at least in this, I see Jefferson, we go back to Mercy. Mercy calls Jefferson, in the rest of that quote, a man with correct judgment, precision, and dignity, which have ever marked his character. And to think, she's from Massachusetts. And she saw across those borders, across those boundaries, and she linked with him. Well, on that note, thank you for the opportunity. And boy, there's so much I left out, as is always the case in lectures. There's so much more we could talk about and so much more fun we can have, but that will wait for another day and another opportunity. And I hope it's soon. Thank you.